And so today maybe I'm asking this question. Is there anything special about us? Are we just the latest and greatest in the evolutionary chain? Or are we something more? Is there any inherent value to us above other created things? And the prevailing opinion of the academic influencers today would hold the naturalistic perspective. So I'm going to use that word over and over again. And so I'm going to define it now so you know what it means. This naturalistic perspective says that you began as a single-celled organism and subsequently crawled out from the water, grew legs and eyes and thumbs over millions of years. Through natural selection, your ancestors began to walk upright and use their brains more and more, and then transition to Homo sapiens, who would use tools and fire and learn language and write poetry and engage in philosophy and ultimately theology. Thus now, man is the top of the food chain because of our intellect, which surpasses other creatures that have evolved at differing rates, but we are no different than other creatures, other than the fact that we are just faster at evolving, okay? That's naturalism. Only natural things exist. This entire process was preceded by a massive explosion of tightly compressed matter that flung everything into orbital location that would become what we see today. And this happened over 4.5 billion years ago. And so I've been having this discussion long enough with friends and family and others to learn, never assume that nobody in the room believes what I just said, doesn't believe what I just said. Chances are somebody believes what I just said. And so we don't want to come from it from the perspective of, well, only idiots would believe that, because a lot of the world believes that. Mostly educated white countries, but nonetheless, a lot of the world believes that. And so if you want to make a difference and touch lives of actual breathing people that are in your life, you have to be prepared to at least discuss this with them because they care about it. If I'm a felt need guy in one area, it would be, let's at least address what questions people are asking. I think the Bible is good enough to do that. So if you do believe in the naturalistic world that I just described, I would like to offer you about a 30-minute to 50-minute discussion. And so I would just ask you to pause your presuppositions for a moment, because everything you hear is interpreted through a presupposition. And so if you come in and think everything I say is going to have to go through the filter of evolution, it's not going to work for you, just like the opposite way won't be true. So I would ask you just to cleanse your mind of presuppositions just for a second and listen to the biblical perspective of where we came from. And that's what I'm going to offer you today. And so last week, Joe spoke to the question, who is God? Who is the creator? Well, this week I hope to answer the question, who are you? Fair question, right? Probably a good thing to know. Why do we exist? And so, in contrast with the naturalist worldview, the Christian worldview asserts that an all-powerful, all-wise, Trinitarian God predates matter, and by his words, spoke creation into being. Amen. He would then go on to refine and design elements of our world, and I think the how of creation often outweighs the why, and I think that's sad. I love a good debate on the methods. You guys know me. You know I love to debate whether 24 hours really means 24 hours and all of that stuff. And how did God do this? Theistic evolution versus 6-day young earth. I love it. Fun for me. But I think it's more important, probably, to understand the why than the how. Why did God create? And so the answer to that is really in the climax of the song. What song, you might ask? The song that is Genesis chapter 1. You see, Moses, the author, was not primarily recording a scientific treatise for us to examine, but rather a song for his people to learn and to memorize about the history of where their faith came from. And you might see, song? I don't see any song. But let me remind you of something that happened in Exodus 14 and 15. Moses also authored Exodus. And so Moses led the enslaved Israelites out of Egypt through the 10 plagues and through the Red Sea. Anybody seen Prince of Egypt? I know that's where all of this comes from. That's the original source work. And so as soon as it's over, as soon as they get out, they cross over, what's the first thing Moses does? He writes a song about what just happened. And so, why? It's because he didn't want anyone to forget what just happened. And songs are incredible ways to pass down history, especially in those cultures. And this is exactly what you see in Genesis 1. It's the reason that Genesis 1 and 2 both contain the same stories. You're going to hear at some point in your life, well, don't you know, the Bible can't even get the story straight, because there's Genesis 1 talks about the creation of man. Then Genesis 2 goes on and tells the story again. What's up with that? It's not that hard. Genesis 1 is a song. Genesis 2 is not. It's not that difficult. Genesis 2 focuses in on the creation of man. And Genesis 1 is the macro. It's a big wide lens view. It's not that hard. And so there are repetitions and refrains in Genesis chapter 1. And so I'll give you a couple examples. And I would just go ahead and open your Bibles right now. I know you got to turn a long way, page 1. So open your Bibles, look at the first page. I don't have it on the screen, so don't look up there. I like to practice having you look at hard copy things. And so I just scan your eyes over chapter 1. You're going to see these phrases over and over again. Each day begins with, and God said. Okay? Every day begins with, and God said. And you should note there that our God is a speaking God. When he speaks, things happen. You'll also see, and it was so. That happens over and over again. When he determines to do something, guess what? It happens. Each day ends with, and there was evening and morning. The second day, and there was evening and morning. The third day, etc. This is poetic language to signal the end of a refrain. Each day, lastly, there are several occurrences where God reflects on his work and says, and God said it was what? Good. God said it was good. You hear that more than once. So why do I labor about this? I'm laboring. Why do I tell you all this? Is it because it's just intended to be a beautiful poem? Is it so that I can say, well, that's not really meant to be taken literally because it's poetry? No, not at all. Moses sang about the escape from Egypt, but that actually happened. David sang about his battles with the Philistines, but that was historical. Deborah and Barak wrote about their victory over the Canaanites in Judges 5. It was historical. So just because something is poetic does not mean it's not historical. All right? That's important, because people are going to tell you, well, you know Genesis is poetry, right? And you can say, absolutely. Man, I believe that with all my heart. But guess what? Something can be true and a poem at the same time. And so that's exactly what Genesis 1 is. So I labor to tell you now the climax of the song. That's where I'm working you to, the climax of this song. In dubstep, it's the bass drop. In rock, it's the breakdown. In worship, it's the third bridge after the a cappella chorus when the groove kicks in on the fourth line. That's what we're working to. In each song of God's creation, it's Genesis 1:26. That's the climax. Genesis 1:26. The song changes at that point. And so we begin with light, then day, then night, then skies, and atmosphere, then oceans and dry ground, wild plants, fruit trees, the completion of the orbits of the sun, the moon giving us seasons, years. And then into the oceans, God sends fish, and he sends sea creatures, and he fills the skies with birds, and he fills the land with land animals. And this creation is increasing in complexity and intelligence, if you'll notice. If it was a bar graph, it would do like this, or a line graph. It would go up in intelligence. But now at the climax, God will deliberate with the Trinitarian Council for the first time and will make something. Let's read now Genesis 1:26 through 31. Then over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, over the livestock and over the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. We'll pause there. The first fundamental difference between creation and mankind, which is really what I'm trying to show you today. I want to show you 3 fundamental differences between you and all the rest of creation. Number 1, man was uniquely created as God's representative. God's representative. I have 3 R's in my outline: reading, writing, and arithmetic. So, that's not true. Look back at verse 26. God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Now, there's a lot to say here. I probably, in retrospect, should have done one sermon on point number 1. You'll learn as you get older. So, I'll adjust that next time. But here's a couple things I want you to notice. I'd love to say more, but I'm not going to. First, I want you to notice the change to plural pronouns. Okay? Do not miss that. If you're a Bible circler, if you like to write in your Bible, those are great words to circle. Us and our in verse 26. Not yet in the song. Pleased to greet you. I mean, what is this? I and most scholars, because I would consider myself a scholar, would agree that this is somewhat a veiled reference to the Trinity. This is divine deliberation in the counsel of God's own will. There were discussions between the Father, Son, and Spirit about the plan for creation. And here you see the Father leading out, saying, let us make man in our image. He wasn't talking to the angels, because we're not made in their image. God was talking to the Father, or God was talking to the Son and the Spirit. Now contrast, this is really the first moment where he makes something. It's not the first time the word made is used, but you may notice that there seems to be a subtle difference between the other creatures. Look just above where it says, let the waters swarm before man and woman, but he is ecstatic afterwards. Mankind takes it up the next level. He makes us, and he steps back and says, now, there's something to write home about. So the next thing I think if you were reading this passage, you would want to know, what is the image of God? What is the image of God? If you look at the world, you compare it to if you look at the word and compare it to other places used by Moses, you see that the word image can be used often as statue, shadow, model, or even the word idol. There's a fun trivia for you. The same word that can be used to be the word behind idol is the same behind the word image, which we are made in. Now, in other words, we are the representation of God to this earth. But more than simply a visual representation, this means that we share certain limited characteristics of God, but are not God's. Okay? Men and women are moral creatures. When a grizzly bear eats Leonardo DiCaprio, but feels no remorse, has the bear done anything wrong? No. Is that an immoral thing that the bear did? Do we take the bear to trial? No, we don't. Why? Because animals do not act morally or immorally. That's not the case for mankind. We answer for our actions. Man and woman have the capacity for certain attributes like mercy, forgiveness, and love. Animals don't apologize to one another. If the female elk in Estes Park cheats on the male elk with another more dominant elk, there's no divorce court. There's no custody battle. You shouldn't have lost the antler battle. You should have won. That's what it comes down to. Men and women have the capacity to relate to God and to engage in personal relationships with Him. You get to know your Creator intimately. When was the last time you came home and caught your dog and cat praying together? That would be disturbing. I used to have nightmares as a kid about coming home and seeing my dog in the easy chair with the newspaper. I don't know why. Isn't that disturbing to think about? But that doesn't happen. So the point is, the image of God that we possess is what separates us from all other created things, including angels. We have it. Nothing else does. You may hear us preach on sin and depravity here occasionally, and we might say things like, there is nothing special about you that God would choose to save you from your sin. But in that sense, that's absolutely true. In a sense of dealing with sin and what you bring to God for salvation. But I want you to know today that if you are a human being, you do have value and worth and dignity because you are made in the image of God. That's true of every single person alive. Every person alive. Hillary Clinton, image of God. Donald Trump, image of God. It's about to get hot in here. So, disabled, image of God. Down syndrome, image of God. Transgendered and homosexuals, image of God. People in severely impoverished countries, image of God. Any skin color that you can name, image of God. You see, it's this belief that we were all created by God in the image of God that allows us to act justly in this world, consistent with our worldview. There are many implications to this, but if you believe every person is made in the image of God and has value and dignity and worth, and that they should be protected in their weakness, the only reason you can believe that is because we hold that we are all made in the image of God. and every other belief. They're just stealing our parts of our worldview and proclaiming it. I might remind you first that the naturalistic worldview, in its atheistic and often progressive manifestations, will cry justice for all people. That's the heart cry of today's progressivism, okay? But their worldview is screaming that we are cosmic accidents at different evolutionary stages, with chance as our mother and Darwin as our father. The Christian worldview, though, tells a very different story. And here are I'm going to give you three contemporary implications to being made in the image of God in a broken, sinful world. And these are good things just for our church to say, because we haven't said a lot of these things just straight up, very clear. So it's probably good for us anyway. Number one, being made in the image of God requires protection for the weakest among us. If everyone is made in God's image, that means the weak have no more or no less rights than the strong. The helpless and defenseless of the world should not have a lesser price tag on their heads. Those with power should not be deciding the fate of those without power based on the convenience of their life. This is the fundamental issue and sin of abortion. Amen. Now, if in the common language of abortion we traded out some words, it would get very uncomfortable. If we traded out the word mother for slave master and the word fetus for slave, you would see many of the same arguments in the buying and selling of life based upon convenience of one over the other. We used to hear things like, I need cheap labor to plow my fields, says the slave master. It's more convenient to not get a person. And the more noble sounding response, I'm just not ready to bring a child into this world. I would be irresponsible to have a child and I can't take care of it the way that I want to. You know who never gets asked their opinion? The child never gets asked their opinion. Every person ever conceived was lovingly made in the image of God. Amen. And their life is valuable, and they deserve a chance. Christians must stand against the sin of abortion. It's not a political issue. Don't allow it to become one. It is a creation issue of life and death for the most helpless ones that cannot fight for themselves. Amen. Number two, being made in the image of God requires a commitment to racial equality. Racial equality. Since everyone is made in God's image, then we are all descended from the same ancestry, right? Who? Adam and Eve. We're all good there? This means that there is no such thing as races. There's only the human race with differing shades of skin. My pastor that I listen to a lot, Vodi Bakum, says that this issue of race is based upon the level of melanin in our skin. There is high melanin people and there are low melanin people. But just like hair color, the level of melanin in your skin is completely genetic and should not be politicized or oppressed for gain. Now, often, it is those that hold atheistic, liberal, progressive viewpoints that tend to lecture Christians for being slave-holding racists. I can't speak to what some fool did a long time ago or even now, what idiots do when they claim our tag. I can't answer to what they do, but I can say that racism is not and has never been supported by God. Right. Now, what I can say about the naturalistic worldview is this. If evolution is true, then there really are differing levels of humanity. Some really are smarter and more developed than others, and some really are closer to their primate ancestors. The truth is that if men and women are not created in the image of God from a single founding couple, then racism not only exists, but it is supported by the evolutionary worldview. There's a reason Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, is usually quoted as that, and not in its full title, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection on the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Christians, above all people, should stand against racism in any form. Right. Number three, and the last one I'll give you for now. Being made in the image of God requires a commitment to respect and equal treatment for women. Created in the image of God. It was not only man created in the image of God, and then, well, we need reproduction, so bring along the ladies. No, that's not how it went. It says clearly in verse 27, God created them, male and female, both in the image of God. This means that men and women are equal in value, dignity, and worth. And Christians, of all people, should uphold this. Now, we'll further explore this in chapter 2, but God did create men and women differently. Both physically and emotionally, men and women are different, but that does not speak to value. If I said, who's more important to the team, the quarterback throwing the ball or the wide receiver catching the touchdown? You would say that question defeats itself, because without one, the other doesn't happen. That's exactly what we have with genders. Both are valuable, and you can't remove one or the other. So it's foolish to try to put a numerical value on one over the other. Now, because of physical differences, there has historically been an ease at which men have oppressed women. And I will say that today, in our context, sex trafficking and slavery is an issue of which the church should have a vested interest. And when you take a woman and remove all of her personhood, you are left with just a physical shell that can be exploited. And this is the heart of sex trafficking and strip clubs and brothels, to create a farm system of women that are not appreciated for their emotions or spirituality or personality, but just a body alone. And unfortunately, this will probably not stop as long as the pornography industry is doing what it's doing and raking in profits that rival the NFL. Christian men must stand up for the equal treatment of women, as Paul says, to treat them like our sisters, our mothers, image bearers of God. Now, there's much more that I could say. Again, I probably should have made that the sermon, but it would be beyond the scope of what I can do right now. I want you to walk away from today believing there is no grounds for treating anyone lesser than you. And those grounds are the biblical worldview. Other worldviews will engage in virtue signaling and selective moral outrage, but the reality is that Christians are to be the light of the world, especially on creation issues, as this is the dignity of every person. Now, before I move from this image discussion, there's one more thing that I do want you to see. And this is probably, for me, the most impactful thing I learned from studying this. I recently went over the Ten Commandments with my 7th grade class at school. And so it's fresh on my mind. I can remember the questions that came, and I made a mental note to remember this. We were going over the first 5 of the Ten Commandments, and we said, commandment number 1, kids, you shall have no other gods before. And all the kids say, okay, well, that makes sense. Do you guys have any problems understanding that? No, God is the only God. We shouldn't have any idols. No Baals. Gotcha. Boom, we're good. Move on. Commandment number 2, you shall not make any carved images of anything in the heaven. So, no, that's not the same. That's a terrible idea. But after studying the passage, I think I have something a little more juicy to say. The reason God never wanted his image to be captured and worshipped could simply be you can't capture the fullness of God. And that's true. But I think the reason that God was so opposed to images of himself being made is that his desire was always for us to be that image, to carry his likeness to the world. We were intended to be the graphic representation of God to this world. But if you've ever read Genesis 3, you'll see Adam and Eve were unable to be that perfect representation of God. And even though today we still possess the image of God, it is a damaged remnant. And so this is why Jesus had to come and live a life that perfectly reflected the glory of the Father. Jesus came to restore the image of God by being it perfectly. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, Colossians 1:15, he is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Hebrews 1:3 says he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And though we are imperfect now, we have the promise that God is restoring us to that original, very good image. In Romans 8:29 it says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of God. That's exactly right. By God's grace, we will authority to rule. Authority to rule. Now, I am going to trim down the time in here, so don't panic, all right? It says in 28, I'm going to read Genesis 1:28 until I can't. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heaven and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast on the earth and to every bird of the heavens and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything he made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Now, I think a lot of people have in their mind, probably just because of sweet old Sunday school teachers, they try their best, that it was supposed to be Adam and Eve in the garden forever. That the two of them were God's little personal friends, and that's how it was meant to stay. Just God and Adam and Eve hanging out for eternity, and that was the plan. But I want you to notice the command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth came before the fall. Before the fall. This means that reproduction and sexuality are a part of God's very good plan for the world, not a consequence of sin. That was taught for a long time in church history. Sex is a sinful thing. You just do it, just have children, and then once it's over, you don't talk about it ever again. But that's not true at all. That's not God's plan. It's a part of God's original plan. And so we see God's command to subdue also and to have dominion. God's plan for us was never to be one with nature or to be a part of the Lion King's circle of life. If I had my voice, I would have probably sung that. But man was immediately told by God, this is for you. Everything. It's for you. We are in charge of all the animals and the plants on earth. Now, I don't have to do a lot of convincing that people are superior to animals and plants. I shouldn't think that I would need to. But there are multiple groups, and I'll give just one, is PETA, that is very well known, that will heartily disagree with what I just told you. But one thing that I hope you'll consider is that it really is only from an evolutionist perspective that one can make the claims that PETA makes. And here's why. I'm going to read from their website. Animals are not ours to eat, wear, experiment on, use for entertainment, or abuse in any other way. More than a century ago, Charles Darwin showed us that all beings have the same common ancestor. All beings share the desire to live. We feel pain, joy, grief, and pleasure. We all have worth. Would we imprison our children in cages too small for them to move? Would we violate our sisters and steal their babies? Boy, that's ironic. Would we deliberately infect our friends with diseases and leave them untreated? Of course not. So why would we do the same to other beings? We must abandon the archaic, incorrect boundary of human, which we use to justify the ongoing massacre of billions of beings. Now, eventually, PETA has to be upfront with why they do what they do, that they are Darwinists that hold the claim that there is no such thing as a human with power, that we are all simply beings. We're just beings. Everything. You and the beetle are both beings. Now, I'm all for treating animals well. I want that to be said. We can agree with some of those things that they said. I don't want laboratory testing or terrible conditions at food processing plants or abusing animals. No one, that's how politics wants to divide people. Well, either you're a vegan Prius owner, or you just want to melt the polar ice caps and kill everyone in Newfoundland. Why do I have to choose those two options? I think we're all smart enough to be better than that. And I want to be able to enjoy the crisp mountain air, the rivers, eat fish that only have two eyeballs. We all remember. Anybody who's a 90s kid, you can remember raw fear at thinking that your Coca-Cola six-pack plastic holder is going to entangle the feet of ducks everywhere. My goodness, I mean, that had worked. So nowhere does God give Adam or Eve any indication that there should be outright damaging to creation, okay? I think if we are bad stewards of God's creation, that we could possibly be offensive to God. I think we can be sinful in the way we treat creation.
Yes.
And he gives us a world to enjoy. We should take care of it. I mean, if we go out and destroy this place, that's like parents paying for their 18-year-old's college tuition, and then they go out and booze it up and skip class and flunk and say, hey, thanks for the 50 grand, mom and dad, but yeah, I think I'm going to do something else. Like that the same offense that you would feel, I would guess, is something that God feels when we are just like, hey man, thanks for those mountains back there. I'm going to go roll coal right all over all of them. You know, like there's a point when it's okay for Christians. You don't have to be a global warming crazy person to think we should probably generally take care of this place. I don't think you have to pick between those two things. And so God has appointed mankind as a special ruler in his creation. We are not animals. We are not animals. We are higher than plants and animals. The animals and plants were made to serve our purposes here on earth, but we should be good stewards of the gift that God has given us. All right, now I'm going to finish up in chapter 2. So you may have to turn a page. Genesis chapter 2, 1 through 3. Thus the heavens and earth were finished, all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished the work he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. The third and last fundamental difference between creation and the rest of mankind, or between us and creation, is that man was uniquely created with a command to rest. A command to rest. This has nothing to do with anything, but this is a good reminder that chapters and verses in the Bible are not inspired and are sometimes put in not great places. So I'm just going to add that out to you. Chapters and verses in the Bible were added in 1227 AD and not originally written with chapters. So it's okay if every once in a while you're like, that makes no sense. Why is that in chapter 2? They should have finished that in chapter 1. Things happen, okay? So on the seventh day, all of God's created work ceased. There was nothing more to add. Nothing more necessary to fulfill the plans of God as far as his creation. The word rested should be understood as ceased working rather than sleeping or catching breath. I think a lot of times people think, man, God must have been tired. No, he could sneeze at universe. Like, let's be very clear. God is not resting because all his muscles are tired and he crawled around in the snow at 2 p.m. on yesterday afternoon for hours and hours in 5 feet of snow. That's not why. It's not the same thing. He is looking back on the job well done. So from this point onward, there really is no new plant or animal creation. Only extinctions. In fact, if you look really closely, you can see the dodo bird in chapter 2. He didn't make it to chapter 3. But he followed the lemmings right off the cliff. And so this idea of Sabbath rest was unique to Israel. In God's context of Genesis 2, it's not because God was tired, but rather he was experiencing the completeness and finality of a job well done. He had just created the universe in 6 days. God was setting a precedent for us that good work should be celebrated and rest should accompany the meditation of a job well done. How easy is it for us to do a really good job on something, a single project or maybe over a couple weeks, and before you even finish that project, your mind is on to the next thing. We never celebrate. This is why we never get any good rest. If that's you, that's why you never get good rest. Because we move on to the next thing before we ever even celebrate the goodness of what just happened. Do you ever maybe feel like all you do is just give of yourself? Chances are you never take the moment to reflect. That's what if you ask what God's rest was, it was a reflective rest. It wasn't an I'm tired rest necessarily. It's good to stop and say, hey, that was a good job. That fills you up for the next thing. It lets your mind kind of cast vision in your own mind of the next thing, because you're not constantly just doing. But if our rest is to be patterned after God's rest, it's to take a moment, look back on what God has done, and say, wow, that was awesome. Thanks, God, for doing that. I'm going to take the day off. and just kind of dream for a day and think about what, maybe you would have me to do, but I'm not going to plan. I'm not going to get into the details of it. That's for tomorrow. And I know scheduling is difficult. I know the American context may be, you got like Japanese is probably worse, but we're one of the top most intense time schedules. Sometimes worship day, which would be a non-working day. But this idea of, I think we can say if it was good enough for God to do this, it's probably a pretty good pattern for us to follow. You might notice God didn't command plants or animals to take a Sabbath rest. Why? Why do we get the Sabbath rest? Why are we commanded to do it? I would argue rabbits can't reflect on a job well done like we can. God's primary concern is not that rabbits don't stress themselves out and be burned out and ineffective in ministry and caring for their families. Not the care in God's mind. But it's not the concern of the rabbits because it's not relevant to them. It's very relevant to us. That's very relevant. If you burn yourself out and you don't take a moment, guess what? You're worthless in all of the capacities that God requires you to be good in, especially if you're the head of a household. I mean, you have responsibilities to be the leader of that family. And if you go out with some complex that I'm going to do everything, I'm going to conquer the world, I'm going to be a hero at work, I'm going to be a hero at church, I'm going to be a hero at home, I'm going to be, Howard Dean, yeah, I'm going to go take the world. I mean, you can't be everything. And you never were meant to be everything.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's okay to say that. God's creative work was done. And next week, we're going to look into chapter 2, and we're going to have a more detailed account, probably, I would guess, of the creation of man and woman. But I do want to leave you with this thought as I close up. We're not animals, nor are we descended from animals. Man and woman are special creations of God, made in His image. And we can commune with Him. We can worship Him. God didn't send His Son to die for animals, okay, or the angels, or plants. In fact, the angels are a little jealous about that sometimes. But He did for us. I hope that you've considered today that you are a creation of a loving God, not a cosmic accident that crawled out from the primordial soup and survived. Life has much more meaning than survival. The great Christian thinker C.S. Lewis said, if the whole universe had no meaning, we should never have found out that it had no meaning. Just as if there was no light in the universe, therefore no creatures with eyes, they would never know that it was dark. If you want to know more about God or what it means to follow Jesus, I would love to meet with you, Joe would, Austin would, any of us would. At the song we're about to sing, you can just walk right to the back of the room and Joe's going to be there to pray with you. Or you can fill out something on your connection card. We would love to follow up with you this week. You are valued. You are loved by a loving, creative God. And let that be something that just makes you say, wow, this week. All right, let's pray. Father,